So to introduce the debate on the presence of or just blacks in and of France and in Europe, I would say that, and we'll talk principally now on France. So it seems to me that the appearance, or what seems to be the appearance of black France on the national stage can be traced back to the 1998 World Cup Soccer Championship and the phrase that were coined to describe the French team, and it was black, blanc, beurre. The last decade, though, was rich in events that shed light on the presence of blacks in and of France and mark a critical stage for the interrogation of what it meant to be black in a contemporary French society. So I'm going to mention a few of those events. The first one I would say is the May 21st, 2001 Taubira law, Christian Taubira, which establishes slavery and slave trade as crimes against humanity. Then the infamous Article 4 of the law, which was passed by the French Parliament on February 23rd, 2005, demanding a reform of educational programs in order to recognize, and I quote, the positive role of the French presence in the ex-colonies, particularly in North Africa. There were also the establishment of the Comité pour la mémoire et l'histoire de l'esclavage, the postponement and then the institution of a day to commemorate slave trade, slavery, and their abolitions in the French colonies, the creation of a federation of black people called the CRAN, Representative Council of Black Association, and the uprisings in the banlieue neighborhoods outside of Paris in the fall of 2005. Then very recently, I think we can add to that the commemoration that took place yesterday when Aimé Césaire entered the secular but sacred place of the Panthéon, where major French personalities are buried, though Aimé Césaire's body remains in Martinique. And then a week ago, Mayotte became, in the Indian Ocean, became the 101st French department. And I was also going to mention the debate, famous debate that on secularism in the French Republic that took place, I would say yesterday or the day before, among members of the right-wing political party in power. But I think I will let my guests express their opinions. But I would like to start with a question that can start the debate. Du Bois stated that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And I'd like to ask my guests what they think, and would they say that France is now dealing with its own color line? And then, if so, how would they define it in a French context? And also in a...
Well, first I have to say I was very interested by Cathy Cohen's speech, because since Obama's election, one question that comes back in France, when we will have a French Obama, and now we are warned what might happen. So I wanted also to add for what you say, Arlette, that in 1998 there was another event, a march of 50,000 people in the street of Paris honoring the slaves, because that was the 150th anniversary of the abolition of slavery in the French colony, and the French government had chosen to celebrate French abolitionism, erasing the slave contribution to their freedom. And we were, some of us were a little scandalized. And there was a march organized, and it was the first time in the public space that people marched with saying we are marching for the slaves. So I think that was also a very important movement that led, in fact, to the adoption of the tolerance law. I want just to say a little things, remain from this group that where do I speak, where do I speak. I am outside of French academia, and my recent experience has been much more with grassroots movement and associations, so I might not have the same approach than academics to some of the question. And I have always perceived France as a periphery, as just one thing among others. I grew up in the Indian Ocean, and when you grow up in the Indian Ocean, France is really in the periphery. Not just geography, but it's really way over there. And that's transformed your cartography of the world. And cartography, the way we see the geography, I think, is also the way we think, in a way. And so when you live in the Indian Ocean, you are very much interested with the South-South exchange, rather than just the North-South axis. So you start to think, Africa, India, China, like that, rather than just constantly this thing. So it's another. And so, as I've said, I've been working quite a lot recently with between grassroots movement and French government to, in fact, this question of inscribing the story of slavery in the French narrative, which is might not been there yet. So to answer to the question, the right question, yes, I do think there was a color line in France, and I think this is very much inscribed, but it's not very much studied, it's not very much explored, and in fact, quite often when I speak about the color line, quite often people tell me, no, it's not, you cannot use that notion. I think that France right now is really going very much through a political crisis. It has still not digested its loss of the colonial empire, and you have really very strong movements in France that continue to target the foreigners as a threat to national identity. And there is really daily occurrence today of the whitening of the French identity and France's history. And concerning really the black presence, it started, with the slave trade. As soon as France started the slave trade, you had a black presence in France, of course, and slavery. But there is, in French thought, there has always been a very strong divide between the geography of its national history, which is always the hexagon, always what's happening there, and what is happening in the colony, which is always over there and not quite France. Even when they speak about the colonizer, they are not really quite French. They are not. Even the slave owners were not quite French. So there is, this strong division of what is happening, what is France and French history and French problem is really there just in the hexagon. So doing that was also, of course, very easy to reject any kind of presence over there in places that did not really concern. And there was also the difficult history of citizenship in France that even during the French Revolution, the long debate about, should the slave be represented and who would represent the slave, and should, the free of color being represented. And that was a long, long discussion and was not really resolved. And when they abolished slavery in 1794, it was really already 3 years after the Haitian Revolution, the start of the Haitian Revolution. So there was this difficult history. There is a very strong erasure of the figure of the slave in the French narrative. And this denial really very strong. I want to give just an example. The feminist movement, the French feminist movement. So if we go back, I say, of course you have the text by Olympe de Gouges during the French Revolution and other. But in 1848, when slavery was abolished, because in France you had 2 abolitions of slavery, because Napoleon established slavery in 1802. Anyway, so in 1848, when slavery was abolished, you had a lot of French feminists who protested because right to vote was given to black men. We know about it in the US, of course. Same thing happened later. But this happened. And you have someone like Hubertine Auclair, who is very, very famous French feminist figure, was a Republican, and she was for the right to vote for women and everything. And she wrote an article saying, we are not niggers. And in which she developed why the right to vote should be given to white women rather than these people who are savages and not civilized, which happened later on, we know, with Cathy Stanton and all them to do this. And this continued in the women's liberation movement in the 1970s, where the French women were absolutely not interested in what was happening for black women or migrant women in France. And I mean, barely, really barely, and certainly not interested. And today, more recently, you have within the French feminist movement also again a strong divide between those who are against Islam, because Islam is of course is oppressing women and they are feminists, and they even go, last year you had every year on October the 17th you have a demonstration honoring the Algerians who were drowned in the Seine in 1961. And last year, on the same day, some feminists decided to demonstrate also against the violence against women. And they had all the left behind themselves, and they say we should not put racism before sexism. So this is really what's happening today. And another example is also about the debate around who is French and what is French today. And finally, I mean, one things I would have, I mean, there are many things we could talk. I think the attack on post-colonial theory, what we call post-colonial theory in France, is really also another symptom of this incredible, and this is in academia, within academia now, which is even among the left, of, the colony will not be a part of French thought, of what is to think about democracy, citizenship, equality, liberty. Freedom is born in France. And even last one thing, when you have all this revolution in Tunisia and Egypt, you have even, I remember an interview with Lionel Jospin, who was the head of the Socialist Party and the Social Movement, saying, oh, we are so happy because now we see they are adapting our values. And so our values, of course, liberty and dignity, and this is still, this was a week ago or 2 weeks ago, so it's still very strongly, incredibly Euro-centered, French-centered, and France has not really done its revolution, what Aimé Césaire was calling the Copernican revolution, that must, occur in France for France and Europe, and he was talking also about Europe, to think differently, and to go, beyond the color line, which, as I say, cross, not just, between left and right, but within the left, within the right, within social movement, within cultural movement today.
Yeah, I would say that color line is almost too prosaic a term, that it is very complicated right now. I think the state of confusion in France, this whole argument about national identity, who is French, this is something you see all over Europe now. In England, David Cameron, a couple weeks ago, talked about the failure of multiculturalism in the United Kingdom. But I can give you an example of the confusion that exists in France from last week. I've been working a lot in the banlieue in recent years, and that's the suburbs, but not white picket fence suburbs. It's concrete projects suburbs where immigrants, factory workers, and now people without jobs tend to live. The inner city in France is usually an outer city. It's outside of the little jewel towns like Paris. So I've been working a lot in Bondy and Bobigny, working with middle schoolers. Last year I worked with a theater director and we put together a play with these kids. This year I'm working on a web magazine with a group of 13-year-olds in the town of Bondy. I work with their English teacher. The magazine will be in English. Last week we invited as a guest to be interviewed Nourdine Nabili. Nourdine Nabili is the editor-in-chief of the Bondy blog, which is a web magazine that started after the uprising riots of November 2005. And it's a magazine where the journalists are mainly people from the banlieue giving their take on different subjects. Mr. Nabili at one point asked the kids in the class, who here is French? About 5 of these 13-year-olds, a class full of 25 people, 25 kids, about 5 of them sort of tentatively raised their hands. And he said, who here is a foreigner? I raised my hand. About 5 other kids sort of tentatively raised their hands. And then Nabili said, who here was born in France? About 20 of the 25 kids raised their hands. And Nabili just shook his head and said, you're born in France, but you don't feel French. Do you feel French? They were sort of muttering around, you know, he said, do you feel Senegalese? Do you feel Moroccan? The kids didn't know. And it was a real window into the confusion that exists in France today, where you're constantly hearing this Republican ideal that everyone here is French, their origins in other countries don't matter, religion doesn't matter, ethnicity doesn't matter, you're all French. But at the same time, these 13-year-olds do not feel French. They're getting this other message that they don't belong here. And I was really touched at one point when Nabili, who came to France from Morocco at the age of 6, his father was a factory worker, he's come up through the ranks of journalism, he said to them, France is one of the most beautiful countries in the world. It belongs to you. And I think this was the first time that these kids were getting that message. So I don't want to spend too much time at this point in the conversation, but I think that France is, like much of Europe, going through an identity crisis connected to immigration. I think that there is this difficulty in having a double consciousness. Du Bois talked about the double consciousness and the warring ideals of being a black in America. I think in America today, lots of people have a double consciousness. What is St. Patrick's Day if not a celebration of double consciousness? You're Irish and you're American. We talk of Chinese Americans, Italian Americans. It's a common definition, self-definition in America. I think the resistance to saying I'm French Senegalese, I'm Moroccan French, I think this impossibility of arriving at a viable double consciousness is part of the problem and the confusion. At least that's what I sensed with the kids in Bondy last week.
Me to speak in English, I will try to do, but I have to apologize for my English really broken. And I will follow some of the statements of Françoise and Jake. I think everybody here agreed with the existence of color line. We can speak clearly of deep racism in the French society. But we have to make a distinction. Further, the simple constatation of the racism, of the use of racial categories, race as explanatory factors. And I think the main difficulties of the discussion is on this level. And there is a lot of confusion about it. And I agree with Jake about the necessity to clarify. And if we come back to Du Bois, I will say, okay, it's true, there is a strong importance of color line division on the basis of color line, but it's one of the divisions among many others. And in the French society, as in many other societies, we have a strong division on the gender line, for example, and on the social-economic lines. And the difficulty of, the challenge for us, the challenge for the discipline, the social sciences, it is to combine, to articulate all this discrimination. And it is very up to date now to speak about intersectionality. Intersectionality is an attempt to bring together all the explanation and don't fall into false opposition between, for example, race and class. As you remember, it was the topic of my thesis a long time ago. And today, I think some things have changed, but I am very often puzzled by the fact that there is not a lot of things new in the French situation about that issue. The color line, the racism, it's all thing in French society. The thing new, relatively new, is the more easiness to speak openly about it, but on both sides, and I think we have to take care on both sides. There is some of freedom now to some people to speak openly in racist terms, and it is a new phenomenon in France. It's clear, but also it is completely connected. I don't know. I don't want to know what the first and what the second, but it is connected with the fact that one of the ways to fight racism now in France, it is much than before in terms of proudness, ethnic proudness, references to color and references to tradition and references to history. But I can understand completely that, and it is a fact. But when we have to analyze the phenomenon, we have to be careful and to make useful distinction. For example, François did references to the march in 1998 about the recognition of slavery. It is a very important date, but slavery is not an issue completely, totally connected with color line. And we have to, when we do the analysis of that phenomenon, we have to take care of that. And on that panel, it is very obvious. We have my neighbor who's speaking about the experience of black in Europe. Excuse me, you don't look black. Françoise is not really black. I am black in the middle, Jack, etc. That means that we have to do very useful distinction. And if not, we are lost in a lot of confusion. And to be concrete, in terms of slavery, it is a crime against humanity. There is, in the history, there are some whites who were slaves, especially in the Mediterranean world, and in our world, in the Afro-American world, there are some people of color who are slave owners. We have to do with that, and it is completely connected at the question of does color replace, it is one of your questions in the paper, replace the social criteria? I don't think so, because color, it is a social criteria. It is connected with a system of power, of domination, and there is some stress put on the color or on other terms, but we have to keep all that features together if we want to. And the debate are very confused because we don't do that kind of distinction.
Well, Arlette allowed me and said it is a debate, and I actually would. I have two thoughts, and they are connected to the panel, and perhaps we can have them as like an invitation for a debate. And one thing is, I'm not even French, and when as I teach Black Europe, that's also very much I am German, and also see this very much also from Germany, also Black Germany. So one thought is I wanted to share with you is actually that when I taught Black Europe also at Berkeley University, and also when I teach this in my own classroom, it's actually what has already been done in the debate going on in France is actually really helpful for Germany, I would say, because at least it seems that people are already like struggling with the question in France, whereas I would say, and I assume that my German colleagues in the room would agree with me, that Germany simply doesn't even do that. I mean, Germany is at a stage they simply skipped the idea to even address their own history with colonialism. There is no not even a debate, there's not even a conversation in Germany. It's like Germany never was part of any colonialism. It doesn't exist. And even in the academy, I mean, it's really, as in the German academy, it's really, yes, there are debates about the multiculturalism state in Germany, but then of course, I mean, what did I mean? I mean, the Turkish immigrants. I mean, and it seems to be like, it's the topic, and people just love to make this like the topic of the debate. Our Turkish community in Germany, we have to address this, but it's really a totally, it doesn't even exist to even in any form to perhaps go back and like look at German history and in any form to address any form of colonialism, and that's where debates and on like France could actually be could help Germany and also German academics working in these fields to show somewhere, to give examples for this, that Germany still has to do this. And even debates going on in Germany with multiculturalism, I mean, you see people celebrating, let me use, because we did talk about this earlier, like people sometimes confuse this also, like for example we have this Turkish-German filmmaker Fatih Akin, and people just love him, and probably you have seen some of his films, and it's like this idea like now finally Germany is addressing its own problems of multicultural society. But if you really look at all the films, it's really more feeding into the stereotypes, like women are victim, unfortunately they live in Germany, so that Germans, they have a chance to become westernized, but only because of the Germans, and because their own communities and their own cultures are so backwards, but thank God they arrived and grew up in Germany. And anything in this regard, I mean, Germany somehow skipped several steps and just doesn't feel like they ever have to go back then in academic debates about this. And that's where again, where often feel in scholarship that any debates, any scholarship that's done on Black France really could be a very good leading example for debates going on in Germany. And the other one, what I also want to say, and I observe this all the time also when I'm in America, and that's probably more something like to the entire room and to also all the people who actually are not in the room. We are all academics, we are in American studies, and we are, I mean, otherwise you wouldn't be here at the conference. I mean, it means that we are all somehow in African American studies, and again, otherwise we wouldn't be at the CAR conference. And I really observe a lot that many people are, they're privileged African American studies, and where I often think that we would have such a possibility and such a chance if we didn't just see African American studies as African American studies, but if we actually would bridge this and see this as really also like Black diaspora, and then from there, because we. I mean, we do have such a chance in the classroom as academics to be somehow vanguards, and also to that we could influence ideas and really connect this and bring this to a wider field. And I have to say, like, I mean, this is an example too. As soon as you have a debate on Black Europe, boom, the room is empty. And I so observed that. I observed this a lot when I also was, I mean, like at American universities, it's this, and I'm not just saying, I'm not saying that American scholars do this. I mean, I also see this with American studies scholars at European universities. It's not my field, and we're saying we have such a chance if we understood what we could do, like really, and we are giving away this chance all the time.
I think that's a good point. And before we start talking about academia, the scientific circle, I would like to come back to this idea of a French identity, or a confused identity at the moment. And here in France, a lot of people, particularly I would say some politicians and intellectuals, evoke and refute at the same time the idea of multiculturalism as the next place to go in terms of defining a new French identity. So I would like to ask you, where do you see, how do you see the evolution of, if we try to define a new French identity, or something that would maybe not be French identity, but a new identity for France? Where do you see us going? How do you see the evolution of the ethos of identity, which is at the moment still founded, I would say, on the Republican Pact? And would you envision a third way for the French Republic or for France?
I agree with you, it's a European debate, but it takes different forms nonetheless in each country. And if we are talking about France, we could talk about other countries in Europe, or even in Europe as a general thing, what are the European symptoms. But if we look at the French symptoms, there are nonetheless some specific questions. The way secularism is, has become recently a new fundamentalism. The way Islam is even, it's not the same one in Holland or in England. The way Islam is targeted, So I will say that. And the confusion you are talking about among young people is really also because it's very encouraged and constructed. I mean, we have to define that they are French. No, I mean, they are totally constantly denied that they are French, that, their parents, where they come from, it does not exist. I mean, there is never something but Africa, I mean, the African continent, whether it's North Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa, whatever the place. I remember talking with young kids, and I had a class also, very diverse, as we say, and there were some kids from Martinique and other kids from Guadeloupe here, they were born in France. Their parents had come, with in the 60s, 70s. And when I asked them, the question, of course, where they came from, they did not know. They did not know why there were blacks in Martinique. The fact of being black in Martinique has like no history. It had no history. So slavery has happened in the United States and somewhere else, but in Martinique, yes, we had some blacks, but we were French. Okay, but how did your ancestors come? They took a boat. So let's go to Martinique. So it was an incredible erasure. I mean, it was very, very. It's very difficult. And also, I was recently at a discussion again about they wanted to make a special issue about what is to be black in France. And again, we went around the table, 40 kids. I mean, no longer kids, but in the 20s and so on. They had no idea of what their parents had come to France. No idea. And there was no transmission whatsoever.
How do you explain this?
Well, the parents, I'm ashamed from the parents, and the fact that what usually are the transmission, social movement, political movement of the left, or in school, have not happened here, right? So it's not like in the United States where you had like the African American movement who say, okay, we will look at black history, not so black, and so on. Here you didn't know movement, social, cultural movement, or political movement has taken to bring this history. Workers' history has been given little, but not much, but nonetheless. Women's history, yes, but the history of the non-white, to say, very quickly, has not. There is not. It's like there is like a white page. So this kind of like very whitening of things. It's very difficult. I think I speak also with. And last thing is also the question of language. Language is absolutely forbidden. Bilingualism, as you say, is very much repressed. So the kids, their parents speak a language at home, and this language is absolutely forbidden. They have to speak French. French is the language of success, and the language of their parents or grandparents is the language of failure. How do you want them to live through that? So there was really it's really, for me, it's really constructed and encouraged. And a new identity of France? Oh my God, a lot of work. A lot of work.
But how do we go there? That was also
we are pushing, I mean, things have changed. Progress has been made in the last 10 years, yes. Yes. More colloquium, more books, more films, more music, theaters. Yes, things have been moving, conferences and so on. But you have really, have a very strong resistance in the political world, media, and academia, which are really, in a way, the three means of transmission of something. Very, very strong and clear.
But have you seen those transformations, those changes, for example, in the political world or in public policy?
Some, but because you have had struggle, people have been fighting, have been pushing. I mean, you have to really, the government, not from its great generosity that accepted, for instance, the Tourian law. Mm-hmm. It was because we fought we were in the street. And I think things will change because we will go in the street, or whatever in the street. I'm not calling for the revolution, but yeah, yes, I am. But I think we will have to push. Remember, Arlette, the movie Hors la loi. Hors la loi. It's a movie about this generation in 1945 in Algeria, after the massacre in Sétif. And we are following three brothers. One will, become a nationalist fighter. Demonstration at Cannes with elected officials, right? Mayors and things like that. About a film. So it tells you how much, how strongly still, you should not, that. Yeah. It's very still. So we have to push, we have to push. It was inserted. It was Bouchard was inserted. It was incredible. And La Vénus Noire, the movie on the Hotel Venus, same thing. Keshish, Rostak, and so on. And now, for instance, right now, you have 2011, the year of the Outre-mer. Yeah. And the big manifestation event that started is at the Jardin d'Acclimatation, where you had exhibition of human beings between 1817 and 1931. Apparently, nobody, made the connection between having, some music and, of people from different territories at the very place where you had the exhibition of human beings, and some even, died there. Yeah. So, apparently nobody made the connection. So this tells you the blind spot, the incredible blind spot. But we are pushing. You have to, I think, as you say, what do we have to do? To fight. Yeah.
No, you have a good remark, but I just want to add something about the film you mentioned. What I thought was interesting that it was selected Hors la loi. It was selected for the Oscar as one of the foreign films, whereas here in France they selected almost like another version of North Africa and Algeria through the film, I can't remember the name now, with the story of the...
Désormais de Dieu.
Yeah, thank you.
Désormais de Dieu.
Désormais de Dieu. But
yeah,
even
so that was interesting.
Hors la loi was not a French film at Cannes Festival. It was Algerian. Yeah. It was presented under the Algerian.
And then at the Oscar, it was, I think, a French-Algerian film. But I thought what I thought was interesting is the point of view, either of France and then of the Americans. And Jake, I wanted to ask you too, as an American, where do you see France going in terms of this confused identity or confused identity?
Yeah, well, as an American, as an African American, I find that sometimes it's so hard even to decide how to talk about these things with French people. So I can't tell you the number of times I've been in this sort of conference or rencontre littéraire, and someone says, but race does not exist. I say, I agree, race does not exist, but racism does exist. as long as there's racism, we have to talk about this concept of race, or we can't ever attack it. I can't tell you how many times French people have said to me, why do you define yourself as noir? It's just a color. I say, well, you know, where I come from, you know, the color of your skin can determine a lot of what happens to you in life. Black Americans come to Paris and say to me, where's the black community? And the thing is, there are so many black communities here. A Nigerian community isn't going to be the same as a Senegalese community. A Haitian community isn't going to be the same as a Martinique community. It's so much more complex here that it's hard to just get at the source of the problem. I've been here since 1993, I felt that before 2005, people were just in denial, maybe a bit the way they are in Germany still. After the riots of 2005, the denial was over, but I find that the conversations just go around and around in circles. And so that even on a subject like what we call in America affirmative action, just the French expression, discrimination positive, poses a problem. And so I find myself really very frustrated sometimes, just in talking to people about a program for the advancement of minorities in this country, when you can't talk about race, you can't talk about being black, you can't talk about affirmative action. It's a labyrinth, and I think it's going to be a long time before people in this country figure out how to get out of it.
Michel, sorry, but
Oui.
you wanted to add something.
Oui, non, là je vais le dire un peu en français parce que je pense un peu, il faut être vraiment, comme je l'ai rappelé, il faut faire des nuances. Et ce que vient de dire Jack est extrêmement important. On ne comprend rien à tout ça si on ne pense pas que la manière de s'identifier, elle n'est pas absolue, elle est liée à un contexte. S'il y avait une troupe de nervis du Front National qui descendait ces escaliers pour contester la tenue de notre réunion, je serais, et que nous nous mettions à crier « Nous sommes noirs et fiers de l'être », je serais le premier à crier, et vous avez bien compris la manière dont je suis intervenu de tout à l'heure, que je pouvais avoir des réserves sur l'analyse en termes de catégorie raciale. Bon, donc, c'est contextuellement, Césaire, on vient de le fêter hier, disait très clairement, très explicitement, si il n'y avait pas eu d'esclavage, si nous n'étions pas méprisés, si nous n'étions pas écrasés partout, je n'aurais jamais pensé utiliser le concept de négritude, il m'aurait même fait horreur. Bon, c'est-à-dire que l'identification, c'est une manière de réagir à un contexte. Et je veux insister sur ce point parce que ce n'est pas seulement une question de contexte, c'est aussi une question qui est susceptible de recevoir des réponses très différentes selon les situations où chacun de nous est engagé. Je ne suis pas la même chose dans ce contexte-ci, auprès de mes amis, dans mes relations amoureuses, et puis dans ma profession et dans une réunion publique. Ce qui, moi, m'amène à dire, je le dis un peu de manière provocatrice, peut-être pour alimenter le débat, il faut se méfier des gens qui savent ce qu'ils sont. Il faut se méfier des gens qui savent absolument ce qu'ils sont. Parce que, précisément, les réalités de l'identité, c'est que c'est quelque chose de très mobile et mouvant. Et heureusement qu'on est souvent dans l'incapacité de répondre à la question. C'est la question la plus difficile et la plus bête. Qu'est-ce que tu es, toi? Quelle est la bonne réponse à cette question? Ah ben, je suis moi. Voilà comment on peut répondre à cette question-là. Donc, il faut se méfier, parce que ça vient du discours dominant, ça. C'est exactement l'expérience que fait Jack. On lui dit, mais pourquoi vous n'arrêtez pas de vous identifier comme noir? Mais c'est jamais Jack qui a décidé au départ de s'identifier comme ça. Il a été identifié comme ça. Et il réagit, c'est pour ça que je rappelais la position de Césaire. Et que si il avait vécu dans une autre société, allons, rêvons, où ce type d'assignation n'existe pas, ils ne se seraient certainement pas spontanément identifiés comme ça. Donc on ne peut pas, comme toutes les sciences sociales le font aujourd'hui, répéter à longueur de chapitre à tous nos étudiants: l'identité, c'est une réalité situationnelle, conjoncturelle, labile, ça change, et puis continuer à considérer qu'il y a un malaise lorsque les gens ont des difficultés à s'identifier. L'expérience que Jack a faite avec ses élèves en banlieue, moi je l'avais faite 10 ans auparavant, j'étais à Marseille, il n'y avait que des jeunes maghrébins. Pour moi, avec mes préjugés, j'en ai comme tout le monde, c'était des jeunes maghrébins. Alors, je leur ai aussi posé la question idiote. Vous voyez bien qu'on peut être idiot à certains moments. Comment vous dites, d'où venez-vous? Ils m'ont dit, nous, on est de Bellevue. Bellevue, c'était le quartier de Marseille, où ils grandissaient. Bon. Mais ils auraient été en Algérie, ils se seraient définis autrement, etc. Donc, moi, je crois qu'il faut enlever de notre... Il y a un spectre dans nos débats, c'est qu'il y aurait quelque chose de pathologique, ça serait de ne pas savoir, ça serait dans le malaise identitaire. Je sais que pour les Antillais, on n'arrête pas de nous bassiner avec le fait que nous avons un malaise. Moi, je n'ai jamais éprouvé un malaise particulier, simplement, nous sommes inclus dans des dynamiques où les identifications unilatérales nous sont plus difficiles qu'à certains, parce que nous participons d'une variété d'histoires et de traditions. Bon. Et c'est pour ça que j'ai apprécié la remarque de François sur les Noirs en Martinique. C'est vrai que ces questions n'ont pas la même résonance et la même signification. Alors, peut-être on pourrait reprendre le débat en se disant, après tout, c'est pas forcément une conduite et un état pathologique de s'interroger sur ce que l'on est. Après, c'est la grande question philosophique, non? Qui sommes-nous?
So I'm just going to translate and I won't translate everything, okay, just give you a summary of what was said. No, so Michel said that the way of identifying oneself depends on context, and it's a very complex question. He gave the example of Aimé Césaire, who said that if he hated to use the concept of race to identify himself. And so that's a question that it's not easy to answer. And he said that you want one thing in one situation and you are somebody else in another situation. And he mentioned professional, personal situation, etc., etc. And he also talked about identity as fluctuant, mobile, and that also as maybe the most important philosophical question, which is, you know, who you are and what you are. And he also wanted to, he agreed with the example that was given by Françoise when she talked about the people in the Antilles, Martinique particularly, and that some people will identify themselves as French and not as black. And so it's not something that, and he was also tagging the idea that we need to self-identify or identify ourselves with one answer. So, for example, he gave the example of young North African that he met in Marseille, Marseille being a city in the south of France. And so he said he also had prejudice, and so he wanted to know how they defined themselves. And so the young people told him that they were from Bellevue, which is a neighborhood in Marseille. And so, of course, identifying themselves as French and Marseillais. And he saw that in a different context, in a different situation, for example, if he had asked them the question in Algeria, they may have identified themselves differently. So I think that now. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. No, and